If your family ever patched a wound with something from the ground, and you would not know where to start today, sit down, neighbor. I need you to hear this. In the winter of 1917, in a field hospital outside Ypres in Belgium, a Canadian corporal named James Whitfield took a piece of shrapnel through the meat of his thigh. There was no cotton gauze left. The supply column was 7 days out. So the orderly did what the Red Cross training sheets said to do when the cupboard was bare. He reached into a muslin bag, pulled out a handful of dry bog moss, and packed it straight into the wound. 7 days later, when the surgeon finally cut the dressing off, he wrote one line in his notebook. The wound had closed, clean, no fever, no pus. 4 cents worth of moss did what $4 worth of imported cotton could not. Today, most folks in this country could not identify that moss if they were standing in a bog full of it. When a knife slips in the kitchen, they pay $3 for a strip of plastic and cotton that would have made that orderly laugh. But here is the twist. The surgeon who ran the trial that put that moss in that bag was not some backwoods folk healer. He was a colonel in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and the journal Science published his numbers in 1918. What that orderly did has a name. It is called a sphagnum moss dressing. Bog moss, cleaned, dried, and sewn into a thin cotton pocket. By the time we are done here, friend, you will know how to make one on your kitchen table for about $4 total. The materials, the species, the muslin bag, the one step everybody skips that turns a nice idea into something that actually keeps a wound clean. Your great-grandfather knew this. Your granddad probably watched him do it. Somewhere between his kitchen and yours, the knowledge slipped through the floorboards. And there is one part of it they work the hardest to make you forget. It is the piece that does the heaviest work. We will build to it. By the time this is over, you will know every step Corporal Whitfield's orderly knew. The 2 species that work and the 50 that do not. How to clean the moss without ruining it. The exact size of the bag. And the piece nobody teaches. The piece that separates a bandage from a mold farm. There are 7 pieces to doing this right. Most people who try it botch it at one step, and it is the step they never write about in the pretty homesteading books. Get that one right. $4 a moss beats $100 a hospital dressing. Miss it, and you have made yourself something worse than nothing. None of this faded because it quit working. It faded because in 1921, a man named Earl Dixon, working for Johnson & Johnson, put the Band-Aid on a store shelf, and somebody got rich the day you forgot what your great-grandfather's hands already knew. Before we go on, there's something coming for this country, and the news won't say a word about it till it's already on your doorstep. It comes down to one number, 3 days. That's what the stores hold for you. My grandfather Eli's pantry held a winter, and the difference was never money, it was knowing. I'm Silas Mercer, 7th generation on this ridge, and before Eli died, he made me swear that knowing wouldn't die with me. So I set it down, 904 pages of it in one book, silasmercer.shop, links below. All right, back to it. The first piece is knowing what you are looking at. Because there are 380 species of moss on this continent, and only 2 of them will do the job Cathcart's team proved in 1915. Picture your great-grandfather on his knees at the edge of a bog, thumb and forefinger pressed into a cushion of moss like he was testing bread dough. He was not guessing, he was reading it. Red-tipped, spongy, damp cool against the back of his hand, that is the one. Woodland moss on a shady rock, dry and matted flat, that is the one that will get somebody killed. 2 species actually work. Sphagnum papillosum has pale stems, often with reddish or rust-colored tops, and grows in dense hummocks in wet bogs. Sphagnum palustre is greener overall, has larger leaves, softer cushions, and prefers wetter hollows. You find them by field markers in order of importance. Habitat first. Standing water or saturated peat under your boot. Not damp forest floor, not shaded rocks. A true bog or peat hollow. The ground squelches, the water sits. Then the squeeze test. Grab a fistful. Water should run out like a wrung dish rag. Woodland moss just crushes. The leaf structure matters too. Under a hand lens, sphagnum leaves are tiny, overlapping, and feathery. The stems bear little branch clusters like a bottle brush. And the color, green top, sometimes red-tipped, pale below. Never black, never slimy, never brown rotten. Where to look in North America? Peat bogs across the northern tier. Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Adirondacks, the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachian Highland balds, and seeps. In 1915, an Edinburgh surgeon named Charles Walker Cathcart, wearing a Royal Army Medical Corps uniform, sat down with a botanist named Isaac Bailey Balfour and did the work nobody bothers to do anymore. They tested species. Papilosum and palustre, 2 winners out of hundreds. 2 years later, in 1917, an American moss specialist named A. Leroy Andrews wrote to the U.S. Red Cross confirming the same 2 species had already been used successfully on the front lines. That was the moment sphagnum stopped being folk medicine and became documented, published, peer-reviewed battlefield medicine. And then, quietly, between 1919 and 1921, after the guns went silent and Johnson & Johnson's Band-Aid hit the shelves, the Red Cross let the whole program die. Not a law, not a ban, a shelf. Somebody just stopped ordering muslin. Eli wrote about this in 1961. Said his own daddy taught him to look for the red tips, boy. The green ones without red tips will fool you. Turns out Balfour's team said the same thing in Edinburgh 46 years earlier. My great-grandfather never read the Lancet. He did not have to. The failure mode here is grabbing woodland moss, hypnum, polytrichum, common feather moss. No absorbency, no antimicrobial action. Essentially useless. You might say it all looks green. Yes, habitat is the tell. If your feet are not wet, it is not sphagnum. This week, pull up a botanical guide, look at photos of Sphagnum papilosum, then find the closest bog to you on a state DNR map. Just go look. Do not touch anything yet. Learn the eye first. Once you can see it, the next question is how you take it home without ruining it. And there is one thing about harvesting that most folks get exactly backwards. Step 2. The harvest. Picture a Toronto sewing circle in 1917. Volunteers stepped out at dawn with burlap sacks, headed to the peatlands north of the city, and came back before supper with 30 pounds of moss each. They knew a thing about picking that most modern foragers ruin. Tools are simple: a clean burlap sack or basket, waterproof boots, gloves, and a small knife. Bogs harbor sharp sticks and the occasional snake. Mostly, you use your hands. Grasp low at the stem, fingers down at the base of the cushion, not the tips. Lift, do not scrape. Pull straight up. The moss releases from the mat. You want the top 4 to 6 inches. Leave the peat below undisturbed. That is the seed bank, and bogs take decades to recover. Shake in place. One firm shake over the bog before dropping in the sack. Loose debris, small frogs, spiders drop back where they belong. Squeeze once. Compress each handful in your fist. Water sheets out and the sack rides lighter home. Never harvest from a fouled bog. Downstream of a farm, a road, a septic field, a dead animal. Walk away. A good afternoon fills a large sack, roughly 20 to 30 pounds of wet moss, which reduces to 2 or 3 pounds dry, enough for 15 to 20 finished dressings. The Canadian Army Medical Corps ran an operation out of Toronto in 1917 and 1918 that fed sphagnum dressings to Canadian hospitals in France by the boxcar. Volunteers, women, older children, wounded soldiers back from the front pulled moss out of Ontario bogs and shipped it south. The letterhead I have seen from 1918 lists the committee: Miller as chair, Porter as technical advisor, Major Edward Archibald overseeing. Serious men, serious operation, dressings going into serious wounds, not a hobby. Now, nobody in a courthouse banned this, friend. There is no statute. In 1918, the American Red Cross was authorizing sphagnum. By 1925, nobody was talking about it. What changed? Johnson & Johnson had been selling mass-produced sterile gauze since 1887. Band-Aid landed in 1921, standardized, shelved, convenient. And bogs are inconvenient. It got forgotten because there was no money in you knowing and a great deal of money in you buying. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how markets work. The failure mode is over-harvesting one patch. Move around. Take a handful here, a handful there. Bring an empty pillowcase. Fill it half full. That is your first batch. You have a wet sack of moss in your kitchen. Now the trouble starts. Because if you dry it wrong, everything from here forward is worthless. And most people dry it wrong. Piece 3. The Dry. This is where a Glasgow schoolyard in 1917 turns into a picture worth painting. Bed sheets spread on tables in the sunshine, moss layered in a thin green carpet, 12 women bent over it with their fingers picking out twigs and beetles. Spread thin, on clean cotton sheets, canvas, or window screens. Layer no more than an inch or two deep. Thick piles rot. Sun and breeze. Outdoors on a dry day is best. Indoors, near a wood stove or a fan, works. Turn every few hours. Hands clean, fingers combing through, breaking clumps, letting air get to the bottom layer. Pick as you turn. Sticks, leaves, bugs, obvious grit. Everything that is not moss, out. Test for done. Squeeze a handful. It should feel light, crisp, faintly springy. Not cold, not damp. It should rustle like corn husks, not crunch like autumn leaves. That means over-dried and brittle. Rustling springy is the tell. 1 full day in July sunshine. 2 or 3 days in a heated indoor room. A week if it is humid and you are stubborn about doing it in the barn. Eli wrote about this in 1954. He cut his own hand open on a bucksaw and packed the wound with moss he had dried in a tin shed the week before. Worked fine. 10 days later he did it again, same cut, same moss method, and this time he had rushed the dry, packed it into the wound damp, molded overnight. Had to open it back up and clean it out. Left a scar he showed me when I was 19. And when I was 19, I did the exact same thing to my own hand because I had read his journal and figured I knew better. First dressing I ever made molded on my palm inside 2 days. The old man laughed until he coughed. Then he taught me the sound of proper dry moss. Rustles like corn husks, not crunches, rustles. The failure mode is damp storage. Moss that seems dry but was actually still 10% wet will mildew in the sack within a week. You might ask if you can just oven dry it fast. You can, and we will get there. But oven drying is a different tool for a different problem, and it is not this step. Spread your first sack on a bed sheet on the porch. Turn it twice a day. In 2 days, you will know the sound and the feel. Once it is dry, you are one step from the finished dressing. And this next step is the one the Red Cross wrote down to the exact inch because they were not guessing. Pattern break. Everything so far, spotting the moss, pulling it clean, drying it right, your great-grandmother could have taught you this before lunch. What is coming next is the part they wrote down in 1917 to the exact inch and stopped writing down anywhere by 1925. The muslin bag, the measurements. Sit up. Step 4, the bag. This is the piece the Red Cross wrote out in black ink on training sheets sent to sewing circles from Toronto to Dublin to Seattle. Because they had learned that if you got the bag wrong, the moss slumped, the fluid did not move, and the dressing failed. So they specified it. The wartime instruction sheet reads, "All used in home hospitals is put up loosely in small, flat muslin bags of a fairly close but very thin muslin, the bags only being loosely filled, as a rule 2 ounces of the moss to each bag, 10 inches by 14 inches, as allowance has to be made for the way in which the moss swells on being brought into contact with moisture." Break that down. Cloth first. Thin, closely woven cotton muslin. Unbleached is traditional. About 20 threads per centimeter. You want fluid to pass through, but the moss not to poke out. Cut 2 rectangles, 10 inches by 14 inches. Sew 3 sides. Straight stitch, 1/4 inch seam. Leave one short end open. Turn inside out to hide seams. Weigh 2 ounces of dry moss, that is 56 to 60 grams. A kitchen scale is fine. Fill loosely, spread evenly. Do not pack. The moss needs room to swell. It will double in size when it hits fluid. Stitch the open end closed. Firm seam. Double it if you want. Materials cost right now at any fabric store. A yard of unbleached muslin runs about $3. That yard makes 6 or 7 dressings. Thread, pennies. $4 total, and you are holding a stack of dressings your great-grandfather would recognize on sight. The 1918 issue of Science ran an estimate. If the British hospitals had used cotton exclusively that year, it would have cost the war effort not less than 200,000 pounds a year. Moss cost, in their words, practically negligible. In today's dollars, that saved figure runs to somewhere north of 15 million a year. A yard of muslin and 2 ounces of bog moss did the work of a Manchester textile mill. They will sell you the antimicrobial silver-impregnated pad for $4 a piece at the pharmacy. Fine, believe that if you want. Or you can learn what a Dublin sewing circle knew for $4 a batch of 20. And if that box of silver pads is already in your medicine cabinet, friend, that ain't on you. They're very, very good at selling. The failure mode is a bag too tight, so fluid cannot wick in, or too loose woven, so the moss escapes. Buy a yard of muslin this week. Cut 1 bag, just to hold the shape in your hands. You have a bag. It is empty. There is one thing you have to do to that bag and that moss before it ever touches a wound, and if you skip it, everything up to now was decoration. Step 5 is where the honest teachers separate from the pretty ones, because this is the step that is not on most homesteading blogs, and the one the WW1 depots absolutely would not skip. Every WW1 sphagnum dressing was sterilized before it went into a wound. Every one. In the field hospitals, that meant steam sterilizers. autoclaves, essentially. In smaller Home Depots, dressings were steam-treated or dry heat-treated before packing and shipping. Two paths existed. The wet path meant a brief boil in an antiseptic solution, then re-dry. The dry path meant dry heat in a controlled oven. The wet path is what most modern accounts describe when they describe anything at all. The dry path, the one the industrial-scale depots actually used, the one that produces the shelf-stable, ready-to-use dressing, is what most modern accounts leave out entirely. We will get to the exact numbers in a minute. I am not your doctor, friend. This is history and skill. On a minor cut in the backcountry with nothing else, a properly sterilized sphagnum dressing has kept people alive for 100 years. On a deep or dirty wound near a hospital, go to the hospital. I will show you the line. You decide. Eli wrote about a logger in 1954 who took a PV hook across his forearm 8 miles from any road. Eli packed the wound with sterilized moss he had carried in his oilcloth kit. Kept the man alive for the ride out. Doctor at the hospital in Silva said the wound was cleaner than half the ones that came in from town. That was moss that had been through Eli's stove and Eli's clean muslin, not a bog handful. The failure mode is applying non-sterile moss. It is still absorbent. It is still mildly antimicrobial, but you have now delivered bog bacteria straight into a wound. That is a net negative. That is how you turn medicine into infection. You might think the antimicrobial action of the moss will handle it. Sphagnum slows bacteria. It does not kill everything. And it certainly does not kill what you just walked in through the bog gunk. For now, get the muslin cut and get some moss drying. When we get to the master reveal, I will give you the exact numbers on the sterilization step, the temperature, the time, the way to do it in a kitchen oven. That is the piece they buried. With a sterile dressing in hand, the next question is how you put it on a wound. And this is where you find out why the moss beat the cotton in the first place. Pattern break. The next two pieces are where the moss stops being folk knowledge and starts looking like something the pharmacognosy journals only figured out in the year 2003. Because the why of this thing, the chemistry underneath, is what the industrial dressing makers spent 100 years betting you would never learn. Step 6. The dressing goes on the wound. And this is where a stretcher bearer in a Belgian trench figured out something a laboratory in 2003 finally proved with numbers. Expose the wound. Remove clothing fragments, mud, obvious contamination. Rinse with clean water if you have it. Place the sterilized moss bag directly over the wound, muslin side against skin. Center the bag. Wrap with roller gauze or a clean triangular bandage. Firm, enough to hold, not enough to cut circulation off. If fingers below turn blue, loosen. Change frequency is less often than cotton, because sphagnum holds 16 to 20 times its weight in fluid. One bag holds where cotton would need 3 changes. Watch for breakthrough, blood or exudate wetting through, or smell change. Then swap. Here is what a pharmacognosy paper in the early 2000s put in a peer-reviewed abstract about a compound in sphagnum called sphagnum. Sphagnum wound dressings combat infection by immobilizing bacterial cells and depriving them of their nutrients. Because of this mechanism, there is no realistic possibility of pathogens developing resistance. All pathogens, irrespective of identity, are subject to the action. Sphagnum is not toxic to living cells. That is a modern research team in a modern journal describing exactly what Colonel Cathcart's team documented in 1915 without ever knowing the molecular reason. And in 2026, a supplement to the British Journal of Dermatology called Sphagnum Moss Dressings the roots of modern wound care, recording that over 1 million dressings were used in World War I hospitals and that they successfully managed suppurating wounds and trench foot when the cotton supply collapsed. The failure mode is bandaging too tight. Same risk as any dressing. The other failure mode is leaving a bag in place too long without checking. Even a great dressing needs a look every 12 to 24 hours. Practice the wrap on your own forearm this week. Empty muslin bag, roller gauze. Get the feel for firm but not tight. There is one more piece, the piece that ties frontier men, Alaskan healers, and WW1 orderlies together. And it is the piece that tells you the moss was never a European invention in the first place. Pattern break. Everything you have just heard, an Edinburgh surgeon wrote down in 1915. But the practice? The practice was already 3,000 years old, and the people who knew it best on this continent were not wearing British uniforms. They were here first. Piece 7. The lineage. Because before Cathcart, before Balfour, before the Toronto sewing committees, there were Alaska Native healers warming red sphagnum on hot rocks in a wood smoke dwelling, laying it on a bad cut, binding it with soft cloth or hide. There were Lapland herders and Newfoundland fishermen packing bog moss into wounds. There were Cree and Ojibwe midwives using it at scale for centuries. The older method, which the frontier men in your history borrowed from, used fresh moss, not always dried. Native practitioners often used sphagnum fresh, gently rinsed, sometimes warmed. Warmed on hot stones. The heat did two jobs: softened the moss into a compress and killed off surface bacteria, a field sterilization method that predated autoclaves by 2,000 years. Held with bark, hide, or woven cloth, no muslin bag. The moss itself was the packing, also for eyes and infected places. The Alaska Native record specifically notes red sphagnum as good for sore eyes, a use European medicine only rediscovered later. The frontier crossover. American mountain men, trappers, and homesteaders learned this from native neighbors and from immigrant Scandinavians who had carried the practice from Lapland. It ran up and down the Appalachians and out into the Rockies through the whole 19th century. Virek and Carey's Ethnography of Alaska Native Medicine, an actual University of Alaska Fairbanks curriculum text, records red sphagnum being good for a dressing on a bad cut or for sore eyes. The healer warmed it on hot rocks first. A conference paper in the bryological literature called Sphagnum, the Healing Harvest, documents parallel use in Lapland and Newfoundland. Same moss, same purpose, 3 continents, no shared textbook. That is not tradition. That is convergent evidence. Different peoples finding the same working answer because it worked. The failure mode is assuming the natives just used any moss. They did not. They read the bog the same way Cathcart's team read species under a microscope, by generations of watching what healed and what did not. If you are of native heritage, or you live near a nation with a bog tradition, ask. This knowledge is still alive in some places, and it belongs to the people who kept it while everybody else was buying cotton. All right, you have the pieces. Species, harvest, dry, bag, application, chemistry, lineage. 6 pieces. But I told you there were 7, and I told you one of them was buried harder than the rest. It is time. That corporal outside Ypres, James Whitfield, 4 cents of moss, 7 days in a muslin bag. When the surgeon cut the dressing off and wrote, "Wound closed, clean, no fever," he was not writing about a miracle. He was writing about a dressing that had been sterilized in the field hospital's steam autoclave the day before it went into the wound. That is the peace. Not the moss, not the muslin, the heat. Sterilization is what turned bog gunk into medicine, and it is the exact piece the Red Cross stopped teaching the day the Band-Aid landed on the shelf in 1921. Here is the home protocol, written down in plain numbers the way Eli wrote it in his journal after he had argued the point with a country doctor for 20 years. You take your dried, sorted moss. You spread it in a shallow metal pan, 1 inch deep, no more. You put it in your kitchen oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, that is 120 Celsius, for 30 minutes. Not 350, not 400. That will scorch it and kill the sphagnum. 250 for 30 minutes. Dry heat. You take it out. You let it cool on a clean towel. You weigh out your 2 ounces. You slide it into the 10 by 14 muslin bag. You stitch the bag closed with a needle you have dipped in isopropyl alcohol. You put the finished bag in a clean glass jar with a tight lid. That jar sits on your shelf for a year, ready. That is the whole thing. That is the piece Johnson & Johnson bet you would never learn, because a jar of sterilized bog moss on a shelf, ready to go, for $4 total, that is a whole industry's worth of shelf space you do not need. This was never really about a bag of moss, friend. It was about being the kind of person who does not have to drive 20 miles to a pharmacy at midnight because a child got a bad cut. It was about walking into your own pantry, opening a jar, and knowing exactly what is in it and exactly what it does. Your great-grandfather lived like that. Every one of them did. And somewhere in the last 100 years, we traded that quiet certainty for a plastic strip that costs $3 and does not even stick when your hands are wet. You do not have to build the whole kit this week. Do one thing. This Saturday, drive to the nearest bog on your state's DNR map. Just go look. Learn what sphagnum looks like on the ground. That is the whole first step. Next Saturday, bring a pillowcase. The Saturday after that, spread the moss on a bedsheet on your porch. 3 Saturdays, and you will be further along than 99% of the people in this country. Your granddad knew this. Somebody just did not get the chance to hand it down to you. That is what I was here for. Tell me down below, did your grandparents ever mention moss on a wound? Was it in your family, or did it slip through? Was there a bog on your granddaddy's land you did not know had anything worth knowing on it? The skill that gets the most comments is the one I go deep on next. A skill that closed a corporal's wound in 7 days 100 years ago. Almost gone. Now you are one of the keepers. Next time, the $2 pantry skill that put a whole preservation industry out of business, and the year the USDA quietly stopped teaching it in home economics classrooms. Keep the old ways. They kept